In a courtroom thick with tension, Cuba Gooding Jr. stepped forward, not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a man burdened by years of silence. The Oscar winner, once cheered for his iconic roles and charismatic presence, now looked weathered. His voice steadied only by a deeper need to finally tell the truth. "I'm not here to protect anyone anymore," he began. That single line shattered any illusion that this would be just another celebrity trial. This was not a performance. This was confession. It was the first time Gooding Jr. publicly spoke under an oath about his connection to Sean "Diddy" Combs, and the night his own name became tangled in what may be the most explosive scandal in entertainment history. What followed wasn't a script. It was raw, disturbing, and brutally honest. From the moment he began describing casual interactions with Combs, industry mixers, lavish yacht parties, there was a feeling of something festering just beneath the glamour. Diddy, he said, made people feel important. But that charm, Cuba, warned, came with a price. When asked about a night involving a young man named Lil Rod, his voice cracked as he recalled the dread in his gut. "I didn't do anything. I didn't touch him. I swear to God," he told the court, locking eyes with the jury. The implication was clear. Something was being orchestrated around him, something dark, something he refused to participate in, but also something he never spoke up about. Until now, Gooding's testimony didn't just implicate others. It peeled back layers of his own guilt, fear, and shame. He owned up to his past, his own legal troubles, settlements, and public downfall, but drew a hard line. This wasn't me. He wasn't there to save face. He was there because silence had become unbearable, because the walls were closing in on a culture of secrecy and power, and because, in his words, silence doesn't protect anyone. It only makes the monsters bolder. This was not just a celebrity dragging another into the mud. This was a reckoning. A man who had lived through the height of fame and the depths of disgrace, now choosing to shine a light on what he saw, what he heard, and what he failed to stop. His words, broadcast and shared across the globe, struck a chord not because they were polished, but because they were real, shaky, painful, necessary. This introduction isn't just about Cuba Gooding Jr. testifying. It's about what happens when someone finally decides that telling the truth is more important than preserving what's left of their reputation. And this is only the beginning. Cuba Gooding Jr.'s story didn't begin with a scandal. It began with charm. In the early 2000s, he met Sean "Diddy" Combs through a mutual friend. Back then, it felt like being pulled into a new orbit, one filled with star-studded parties, red carpets, and invitations that promised success and status. He was charismatic, Cuba recalled, powerful. He knew how to make you feel like the most important person in the room. Diddy's presence was magnetic, almost hypnotic. He had the kind of influence that could open doors and change lives. But it wasn't long before Cuba realized that behind the sparkle there was a price, a silent cost that no one ever talked about. At first, everything felt like just another part of the Hollywood machine. Cuba described industry mixers and casual events where the elite gathered, shared drinks, stories, and secrets. Yacht parties were common, always exclusive, always extravagant. But there was one party that never left him, a night that, despite his efforts to move on, still haunted him with details he couldn't forget. When asked about the infamous gathering on a yacht, his demeanor shifted. His voice slowed, his eyes dropped, and the courtroom grew still. "I thought it was just another party," he said. But there was something about the way Diddy kept saying, "I got something special for you." It felt off. That something special turned out to be a young man named Lil Rod. Cuba remembered how Diddy introduced the boy, quiet, nervous, barely speaking, as if he were an accessory to the party, not a person. "He didn't belong there," Cuba said. "Not like that." Diddy had instructed the young man to sit beside Cuba to relax. Cuba tried to make conversation, but the boy seemed frightened. The tension in that moment was enough to send a chill through the courtroom. "I didn't do anything," Cuba insisted. "I never touched him. I swear to God." With a raised hand and tearful eyes, he turned to the jury. "Whatever Diddy was planning, I didn't play that game, but he wanted me to. He set it up like that." What was supposed to be a night of celebration suddenly felt like a trap, a performance where Cuba was given a role he never asked for and one he refused to play. When the prosecutor asked him if he felt trapped, the answer came fast and cracked, with emotion. "Yes. God, yes." He paused, struggling to find the words. "You don't say no to Sean Combs. He had people eyes. He didn't have to say anything. He'd just look at you, and you knew." Cuba said he got up and left early that night. Something about the entire setup felt wrong, dangerous. He didn't want to be a part of it. But that night would follow him, stitched into headlines and rumors he couldn't shake. Even though he walked away, the silence he kept became its own kind of participation. In the years that followed, Cuba's name was no stranger to controversy. He admitted his wrongs, legal issues, guilty pleas, civil settlements. He stood in front of cameras and judges and faced the fallout. But when his name became linked to Diddy's growing scandal, the weight was different. This time he hadn't done what they were implying, but it didn't matter. "I've made mistakes, plenty," he told the court, tears in his eyes. But not that. Never that. He described the torment of being lumped into something so monstrous, the frustration of knowing the truth but being unable to control the narrative. "When my name came up in this circus, I thought I'd lose my mind," he said. "I want people to hear it from me, not a blog, not a whisper. Me." The courtroom sat in absolute silence as a recording was played, a deposition from Lil Rod, detailing the night in question. Cuba sat motionless, staring ahead as the words echoed around him. When the clip ended, he cleared his throat and spoke again. "If I ever made anyone feel uncomfortable, I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "But I didn't touch that kid. I didn't touch anyone at that party." He added something that cut deeper than anything else he'd said. "If Sean's team wants to use me as a scapegoat now that the walls are caving in, they picked the wrong man." He then revealed something even more painful, his own fear, the reason he hadn't spoken out sooner. "I should have said something," he whispered, "but I was scared." Those few words were not just personal, they were universal. They spoke to an industry where fear is currency, where power protects the powerful, and where silence becomes the rule of survival. Cuba's early experiences with Diddy were the first hints of a world behind the velvet ropes, a world where influence could be used to isolate, manipulate, and ultimately control. He described how the environment around Diddy changed over time. At first, the events were glamorous and accessible, red carpets and photo ops, but eventually, they became something else. "He started throwing these exclusive things," Cuba explained. "Not even your agent could get you in unless you had the right face or name." He remembered one event in Miami vividly. At the door, everyone was required to hand over their phones, common enough in celebrity circles, but then robes were passed out. Robes. "They said it was a spa-themed party," he said, "but once you were inside, it was like walking into another world." Though part one of this testimony ends here, what's clear is that Cuba Gooding Jr.'s first encounters with Sean Combs weren't just the start of a celebrity friendship. They were the beginning of a descent into a reality where power was used like a weapon and silence was demanded as a price of admission. Cuba hadn't yet seen the worst, but already he knew something was very, very wrong. What began as glamorous gatherings soon morphed into something far more disturbing. Cuba Gooding Jr., seated in front of a silent courtroom, continued to pull back the curtain on a world most only imagined through red carpets and Instagram filters. But beneath the surface of luxury and fame, he described a system meticulously designed to control, isolate, and silence. These weren't just parties, they were operations, calculated down to the last detail. It started like anything else. In Hollywood, he said. Red carpet, champagne, networking. But then the invitations changed. The exclusivity became more intense. No publicists, no agents, no plus ones without pre-approval, and most importantly, no phones. At certain events, guests had to surrender their devices at the door. That part wasn't shocking. It was standard in Hollywood for privacy. But what came next wasn't. Robes. Guests were given robes as part of a so-called spa theme. At tea. First, it sounded playful. But once inside, Cuba realized this wasn't relaxation. It was a ritual. It was like walking into another world, he said, his face tense as he relived it. What he saw didn't feel like freedom or fun. It felt orchestrated, controlled, designed to strip guests of normal boundaries and expectations. Diddy's homes, his mansions in Miami and Los Angeles, weren't just party venues. They were domains where rules shifted and power was exercised in ways few would dare question. Guests were expected to play along, to ignore what didn't make sense, to blend in even when their gut screamed something wasn't right. Cuba remembered seeing women being ushered through back doors, their faces pale, their expressions unreadable. He heard things, screams, crying, doors slamming shut. And the unspoken rule was always clear. Don't ask. Don't look too long. Don't get involved. There was one moment in Los Angeles that Cuba couldn't forget. At another exclusive party, behind closed doors, he wandered into a hallway upstairs. From down the corridor, he heard a girl scream. At first, he froze. Maybe it was part of the entertainment, he thought. After all, nothing in those spaces ever felt real. But then he saw a security guard slam a door shut. Fast, forceful, like he was hiding something. I asked what was going on, Cuba said, and he looked at me and said, "This room's off limits, Mr. Gooding." That's all. No explanation. No follow-up. Just a door closed on something Cuba would never unsee, and he walked away. That decision would haunt him. As the testimony deepened, the details became more chilling. There were parties where guests wore masks, not party masks, but anonymity masks. Not for fun, Cuba said, to protect names. Everyone there had signed NDAs. It wasn't a suggestion. It was mandatory. Breaking the silence came with consequences, and everyone knew it. Diddy made sure of that. He had surveillance, cameras, everywhere. Some were visible, others hidden, and he didn't shy away from admitting it. "I like to keep memories," he once joked, according to Cuba. But they weren't memories. They were leverage. "They were weapons," Cuba said, swallowing hard. Because if Diddy had something on you, you were his. And even if he didn't, you acted like he did, just in case. That kind of control didn't just apply to what happened at the parties, it followed people afterward. Cuba recalled how one producer, a man he refused to name, got blacklisted after attending one of those nights. The rumor? He threatened to go public. Next thing, his deals disappeared. Calls stopped. His name was erased from projects overnight. The message was clear: step out of line, and you're done. When the prosecutor asked if Diddy had ever threatened him directly, Cuba didn't flinch. "Not in so many words," he replied. "But one time at brunch, out of nowhere, he pulled me aside and said, 'We're both survivors, man. We've both seen too much, and people like us, we got to stick together.'" On the surface, it sounded like camaraderie. But the tone, the timing, it felt like a warning. Diddy didn't need to be explicit. His power did the talking. And everyone in his orbit understood exactly what that meant. What's even more terrifying is how that power persisted even as people began to distance themselves. Cuba said he noticed how after his own scandals, many in the industry pulled away, Calls dried up, friends ghosted him, projects vanished. But Diddy? He still called, still invited him, still acted like they were bonded by something deeper. "That made me wonder why," Cuba said. "Because he knew I'd been dragged through the mud. He thought I'd protect him now, like I owed him. This wasn't about loyalty. It was about survival. About being so deep in a world built on secrets that silence became instinct. And for Cuba, the weight of that silence turned into guilt. The realization that he had been part of a system, even passively, that fed on fear, secrecy, and submission. "Hollywood is a dream," he said, "but sometimes it's just a polished nightmare." Diddy's control didn't need to be enforced through violence. It worked through suggestion, influence, and silence, through carefully orchestrated environments where people stopped asking questions, where those who saw too much learned to look away, where parties became stages for something much darker than celebration. Cuba saw it all, felt it all, and kept quiet. Because that's how the game was played, and everyone played it. By the time the FBI raided Diddy's house, Cuba wasn't shocked, he was relieved. Because finally the fear that had controlled so many, him included, was being challenged. He had waited for that moment, hoped for it, prayed that maybe, just maybe, the machine would break. Because if it didn't, the silence would never. And this part of Cuba's testimony wasn't just about what happened, it was about how it happened. How control can be built not with chains, but with charm. How manipulation doesn't always come as a threat. It often comes as a favor, a joke, a knowing glance. And how the deepest prisons are the ones we build around ourselves out of fear of speaking the truth. And that's exactly what Cuba was now trying to do. Break out, speak up. Not to erase his past, but to confront a present that had gone unchecked for far too long. Cuba Gooding Jr. sat on the witness stand, no longer just recounting events, but unraveling the emotional and professional wreckage those events left behind. This wasn't just testimony. It was a confession layered in years of guilt, regret, and unbearable silence. As he continued, the courtroom leaned in closer, not out of curiosity, but because his pain was undeniable. The man once hailed on screens for his charisma and electrifying energy now looked like someone who had been quietly breaking for years. "I was in the headlines for things I did," he admitted. "Yes, and I've owned up to those." There was no attempt to paint himself as a hero or an innocent bystander. Instead, he took full responsibility for his past wrongs. He had pleaded guilty. He had paid settlements. He had been publicly shamed. But what he was addressing now, what he was fighting to make clear, was that this, the accusations linking him to Diddy's alleged crimes, was not something he had done. The tears came as he tried to explain the agony of being seen as part of something he didn't participate in. "This wasn't me," he said with a trembling voice. "When my name came up in this circus, I thought I'd lose my mind." The use of the word circus wasn't accidental. It conveyed the media, frenzy, the whisper networks, the online vitriol that turned real lives into sideshow attractions. For someone already damaged by public opinion, being pulled into another scandal, especially one this dark, felt like the final blow. "I've worked my whole life," he said, "and now people think I was part of that madness." He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was fighting for clarity. He wanted people to hear it from his mouth, not through tabloids or trending hashtags. He didn't want his silence to be mistaken for complicity. And most of all, he didn't want to be used as a distraction by others now scrambling to distance themselves from Diddy as the empire began to crack. As the courtroom played a recording of Lil Rod's deposition describing the infamous yacht party, Cuba sat frozen, staring into nothing. When it ended, he spoke quietly but firmly. "If I ever made anyone feel uncomfortable, I'm sorry. But I didn't touch that kid. I didn't touch anyone at that party." Then came the sting of betrayal. If Sean's team wants to use me as a scapegoat now that the walls are caving in, they picked the wrong man. He knew exactly how this worked. When powerful people get cornered, they start throwing others under the bus. And given his history, given how many people had already written him off, he was the perfect target. Easy to discredit. Easier to silence. I should have said something sooner, he added in a whisper. But I was scared. That fear wasn't abstract. It was personal. It shaped his choices for years. It kept him quiet when he saw things he didn't understand, but knew were wrong. It convinced him that speaking up would only make things worse. And it did. Because silence didn't protect him. It only buried him deeper in shame. The fallout wasn't just internal. The career that once burned so bright was now a dim shadow of itself. After his own legal troubles, Hollywood distanced itself. He became a name people avoided, a liability. Projects he once headlined disappeared. Friends went silent. Some friends went radio silent, he recalled. But not Sean. Sean still called, still invited me. At first, Cuba didn't question it. Maybe Diddy was loyal. Maybe he believed in second chances. But then it hit him. Diddy didn't reach out because he cared. He reached out because he thought Cuba owed him. Because someone with a bruised reputation was easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to use. He shared the moment that drove this realization home. A photo from a 2013 trip to the Bahamas, now introduced as evidence. In the image, Cuba sits next to Diddy, surrounded by barely clothed guests and blurred-out faces. He looked at that picture, his voice cracking. "I didn't know they were that young," he said. "No one asked. No one checked. We just smiled for the camera." What haunts him isn't just what might have happened in the background. It's the fact that he looks happy in the photo, carefree, complicit by association. "I look like I'm having the time of my life," he said, "and all I can think now is how many people were suffering around me." When the judge called for a 10-minute recess, Cuba didn't get up. He stayed in his chair, face buried in his hands, whispering into the courtroom mic. "God forgive me." That wasn't performance. That was the sound of a man unraveling under the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had ignored, and everything he had become. He spoke next of one particular night in Los Angeles. Another party. Another layer of secrecy. Everyone signed NDAs. Everyone wore masks, black and gold, handed out by staff. "I thought it was just theatrics," Cuba said. But it wasn't. It was ritual. He described walking into a back hallway and seeing a scene so disturbing he still struggles to talk about it. People lined up like objects. Diddy at the center, conducting the room like some twisted ringmaster. It was quiet, eerie, Cuba said. "I turned to leave. I didn't want any part of that. But I made the mistake of looking too long." That moment turned to fear. One of Diddy's security men cornered him in the hallway. "You didn't see anything, Gooding," the guard said. "That's the rule. You want to keep working, right?" Cuba nodded. He didn't push back. He didn't fight. "That's all I could do," he admitted. "I wasn't brave back then." The shame in his voice was deafening. This was the moment he chose survival over conscience, a choice so many others likely made too. This is what the industry never shows. The toll, the erasure of humanity. The slow destruction of a person's soul as they become part of a machine that rewards silence and punishes resistance. I know, some people are going to say, "I'm just doing this to clean up my image," he said. "But I don't care. If my testimony helps stop even one person from getting hurt like that, it's worth every headline, every insult, every backlash. Because the consequences of staying quiet didn't just cost Cuba his career. They cost him his peace, his self-worth. Every night, he's haunted by what he saw, what he didn't do, and the eyes of those he failed to help. "I lost years trying to rebuild what I broke in myself," he said. "And I'll never fully Get back what I lost. But now he's doing what he can, speaking, testifying, finally breaking the silence that cost him so much. Because maybe, just maybe, the truth can do what silence never could, set him free. Cuba Gooding Jr. didn't wait for another question. As he returned to the stand after recess, something had changed in his posture. His shoulders were heavy, but his voice had found a new clarity. He gripped the edge of the witness box like a man holding on to truth for the first time in years. "I have to speak on this next part," he said. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't for show. It was something that had been buried inside him, burning, festering, now finally rising to the surface. He began describing a weekend retreat in the Hollywood Hills, a party Diddy hosted under the guise of a birthday celebration. No press, no phones, the usual protocol. But from the moment he arrived, the energy was off. Not festive, not wild, tense, controlled. It felt like everyone was waiting for something, he said. Around midnight, masks were handed out, black and gold. It was supposed to be a theme, part of the theatrics. But it didn't feel like play. When Cuba walked into a back wing of the mansion, he was hit with something he couldn't unsee. People lined up like props, men, women, barely clothed. And in the center, Diddy, presiding, like a king over some twisted ceremony. It was quiet, eerie, Cuba remembered. "I turned to leave. I didn't want any part of that. But I made the mistake of looking too long. A security guard cornered him, got in his face. 'You didn't see anything, Gooding. That's the rule. You want to keep working, right?' And in that moment, Cuba nodded. He didn't fight back. He didn't ask questions. He just got out. 'I wasn't brave back then,' he said, and that failure, the choice to protect himself instead of someone else, became a wound that never healed." Cuba knew what people might think, that he was speaking up now to save face, to rewrite his past, but the emotion in his voice crushed any sense of strategy or calculation. "If my testimony helps stop even one person from getting hurt like that," he said, "then it's worth every headline, every insult, every backlash." He then dropped a detail that froze the entire courtroom. "I saw people there that night who are now publicly distancing themselves from Sean. Celebrities, executives, people with families and empires. They all looked the other way, and now they're saying they knew nothing. That's the lie that hurts the most." He wasn't pointing fingers to tear anyone down. He was holding up a mirror. Because this wasn't just about one man's crimes. It was about the culture that let it happen. "The reason I'm speaking now," Cuba continued, "is because I watched that house turn into a graveyard of innocence. And I did nothing. I'm not going to make excuses anymore. I was complicit by staying quiet." He paused, the silence landing like a drumbeat in the room. "I could have stopped something. I could have asked questions, but I didn't." At another party in Las Vegas, Cuba saw something else, something that stuck with him even more than the screaming girl behind the closed door. A young woman being pulled down a hallway. He didn't know her name, didn't even know if she was legal. But he saw her eyes. She tried to signal him, and he looked away. "I just walked away," he said. "It keeps me up at night. Because the truth is, there were dozens of those girls over the years. And we didn't ask questions. Nobody did. We were too scared, too selfish, too deep in the world Diddy built." The prosecutor asked if he ever told anyone. Cuba nodded slowly. "I tried once," he said. In 2016, he called a lawyer friend, told him everything, the masks, the parties, the secrecy. The friend warned him, "Drop it." Said the NDAs would bury me, said I'd be painted as unstable because of my own charges. So, once again, Cuba went silent. But then something changed. Cassie came forward. Lil Rod spoke out. And suddenly, Cuba realized he wasn't alone. That gave me the courage to reach out to the prosecution. he said. To say, put me on the stand, I'll talk. Because he thought, if someone had spoken up back then, maybe that girl in Vegas wouldn't just be another cautionary tale. I'm not looking for redemption, he told the court. That's between me and God. I'm looking for justice, for the people who got hurt, for the names we'll never know, for the ones who never made it out of those houses. He then turned toward the defense table, where Diddy sat stone-faced. I hope you hear this, Sean. I hope you remember every name, every scream, every party you turned into a prison, because we remember now, and the truth is louder than your money. There was a long pause as the room absorbed the impact. Then the prosecution asked one final question. What do you want the world to take from your testimony? Cuba looked straight ahead. That silence is a chain, and I broke mine. He didn't stutter. He didn't blink. He wanted people to know that you don't have to be perfect to speak out, that your past doesn't disqualify you from protecting others, that telling the truth even late still matters. Hollywood has this sickness, he said, this addiction to power. And Sean, he was the dealer. He made people feel like gods, and in return, they gave him loyalty. I know, because I was one of them, and it cost me. My career, my reputation, maybe even my soul. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. I lost years trying to rebuild what I broke in myself, and I'll never fully get back what I lost. But I can be a witness. I can be a voice. Then something shifted again. This time the emotion wasn't guilt. It was relief. His eyes welled up, not with shame, but release. I can't keep carrying it. I can't keep pretending I didn't see what I saw. And then, without being prompted, Cuba stood. He faced the courtroom like it was the world itself. I'm sorry. To the women, to the people who thought I was better, to the ones I didn't save. He sat back down, drained, empty, honest. And the courtroom remained silent. No gasps, no movement. Just the weight of a man who had finally laid down the burden of silence, hoping it might help someone else pick up the courage to speak. As the courtroom fell into stillness, Cuba Gooding Jr. sat back down, not as the actor audiences once adored, not as a defendant trying to dodge judgment, but as a man who had finally chosen to confront his silence. His final words weren't loud, but they carried more weight than any outburst could. I'm sorry, he said, softly, steadily. To the women, to the people who thought I was better, to the ones I didn't save. With that, his testimony ended not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet, broken truth finally spoken out loud. Looking back on his journey, it's clear this wasn't about redemption. It wasn't a PR move or a strategy to resurrect a career. Cuba made that clear from the start. This was about reclaiming a piece of himself long buried beneath shame and fear. His story began with a friendship, a connection to a man who wielded influence like a weapon, cloaked in charm. Over time, the veneer of luxury fell away, revealing something rotten at its core, a system where manipulation thrived in the shadows, where silence was currency, and where complicity didn't always look like action. It looked like inaction, and Cuba had been part of it, not by what he did, but by what he didn't do. Throughout his testimony, he didn't pretend to be a hero. He owned his past, the charges, the guilt, the harm he'd caused. But he drew a line when it came to Diddy's world. He had seen too much, heard too much, and done far too little. He admitted it all, painfully, piece by piece. The parties, the girls, the masks, the cameras, the whispers. Every disturbing memory he once shoved aside was now laid bare. Before the world. Not to point fingers, not to play victim, but to say, this happened. I saw it, and I can't keep quiet anymore. His final message was one of reckoning, not just personal, but collective. Silence is a chain, he said, and I broke mine. That line alone speaks to what this moment meant. For too long, the entertainment industry has operated behind a shiny curtain where power protects power and truth gets buried under NDA's influence and image. Cuba's testimony ripped through that illusion, exposing not just one man's abuses, but the culture that let them flourish. It took years for Cuba to find his voice again, and even longer to use it for something other than defending himself. But in this moment, on that witness stand, he did something few in his position have dared to do. He told the truth, no matter the cost. He wasn't seeking applause. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He simply needed the world to know that silence didn't work, that it only made the monsters bolder, and that the only way forward, even from the darkest past, is to speak. So now, as his words echo far beyond that courtroom, they carry a call to everyone who's ever looked away, ever stayed quiet, ever told themselves, "It's not my place." The truth doesn't erase the damage done, but it opens the door to something else, accountability, maybe even healing. For Cuba, that's what this was about. Not redemption, but responsibility. And for the rest of us watching, maybe it's a reminder that the real fight for justice doesn't start when the cameras come on. It starts when someone finally refuses to keep the secrets anymore. Now that you've heard every word, every tear, every truth, ask yourself, how many people stayed silent? How many more stories are out there waiting to be told? Cuba Gooding Jr. didn't just testify for himself, he spoke for those who never had the chance. If this story made you feel something, anger, heartbreak, maybe even hope, don't let it end here. Drop a comment, share your thoughts. Hit like if you believe in truth over silence. Subscribe and join us as we uncover more untold stories that demand to be heard. Together, we can be louder than fear. Together, we break the silence. This isn't just a video, this is a wake-up call.